I want to tie things up, more or less, and talk about how it seemed to me that things progressed. Now, it's not altogether a coherent theme throughout, because we were going from one thinker to the other. In many respects, they were talking about very different things. We began the course with a really, really liberal interpretation of what political philosophy is. Philosophy was what? Does anyone remember from way back there at the very beginning, the general characterization of philosophy? Not specifically what people with PhDs in philosophy do. I mean, it's not limited to anything like that. It's supposed to be, philosophy is something that's supposed to be, in my outline of it, part of daily life. I think I even said something like, people need to do philosophy as much as they need to breathe, which is a pretty bold remark.
It's the study of things that don't yet have clear-cut answers.
Yeah, I claim that when philosophy is the examination of questions that don't yet have clear-cut answers or clear-cut modes of resolution. That means that stuff that people haggle about in day-to-day life or worry about just by themselves, it's not necessarily something that involves human interaction. You can do probably some of the best philosophy, or at least the most agonizing philosophy that one ever does, all by yourself as you're trying to figure out answers to questions that puzzle you. But whenever in day-to-day life or at the state of the art of some arcane discipline, wherever it is, if people are trying to grapple with questions that don't yet have clear-cut means of resolution, then they're dealing with questions, as far as I'm concerned, are philosophical. The main thing I wanted to get at there is that they are not constrained. Philosophical questions are not only found in a particular discipline, namely philosophy, in academic institutions like universities. They're not limited to that. And that they sort of transcend, or at least they can transcend disciplines. They're not, they're sometimes academic, sometimes not academic, and everybody, to some extent or another, has to deal with philosophical questions. And then political philosophy, political and social philosophy, appropriately enough, is an attempt to examine questions in the political and social realm. And as far as I can tell, that's a huge number of them that don't yet have clear-cut modes of resolution. So wherever we're dealing with questions about society, about politics, and where the people who are as well trained as anybody gets in those fields, if they still disagree about the answers to these questions, then they're political and social philosophical questions. So that was the argument I offered then. And in that connection, the things I said early on in the quarter about the positivistic movement in the 19th century takes on a special meaning. The positivists, I think you'll recall, does anybody remember what they said? This is, again, it's not exactly a test, but the positivists, Auguste Comte in particular, wanted to try to make science something like the religion of mankind, to try and bring scientific method to the examination of all kinds of questions that hadn't, at least in the view of the positivists, hadn't yet been dealt with scientifically. And in particular, in the social and political realm. The positivists wanted to bring scientific rigor, scientific method to those disciplines. The idea was to banish religious modes of thinking and philosophical or metaphysical modes of thinking. Those were things of the past, according to the positivists. And what we now needed to turn to there in the modern 19th century, we need to turn our attention to science. And that, quite literally, was supposed to become the new human, it's supposed to at least replace in many ways the human need for religion. I don't think that they imagined that science was going to be doctrinaire in the way that many religions are. And I'm not sure just how sophisticated Comte's understanding of scientific method was. I'm not a great Comte student, but he should have understood that science itself has to remain open to constant evolution. That was already evident in physics by the 19th century. So it wouldn't necessarily be a set of dogmas that we would now embrace, having switched from our other religions to science. But we weren't supposed to be overly concerned with grand systems and dogmas. We were supposed to look at things, look at the evidence, and try and establish our conclusions about the political and social realm in the same ways that scientists in other disciplines figure out what they do. And that led to Comte's establishing sociology as a new science. And so he's the founder of that discipline, which has maintained its integrity as a discipline unto itself to this day. Political science, the whole idea of political science as opposed to political philosophy anyway, grew out of this same positivist movement. And I guess it's been more or less successful. There are some questions that seem to be treatable in clear-cut ways, especially questions that have to do with data about groups, voting behavior of groups, and it's something that goes on in the more positivistically oriented political science departments. They talk about how this group or that group tends to vote, how voting behavior may evolve with socioeconomic changes that go on in a group. These are things that are measurable. People can, you can take polls, you can get all kinds of data and evidence. A lot of the evidence for sociologists and political scientists come from the census that's taken in our country every 10 years. And that census data gives people all kinds of stuff, good hard data that they can use to form generalizations about the present situation of society, the present situation of this group vis-a-vis that group, the changes in the makeup of society over time. And so those things, you can come up with clear-cut answers to questions like that. The theoretical questions, if they're deemed legitimate at all, have still thus far eluded clear-cut resolution, though. So political ideology, anyway, lives on. I think maybe it's something that Comte himself would have preferred get banished, but it has not gone away at all, let alone quietly. So there's some reason to be interested in it, especially since the 20th century has certainly not fallen short in conflicts over political ideology. 100 years after Comte, ideology seemed all there was going on in political conflict, whether it's fascists versus non-fascists, or communists versus non-communists, or capitalists versus non-capitalists. A lot of important ideological questions still seem to be at the top of people's minds when they thought about society, about politics. The questions are old ones, many of them. Whatever questions have been resolved in the course of the last few thousand years have ceased to be philosophical questions, at least partly because of that, on my interpretation of philosophy. But we went all the way back to Plato to begin thinking about political and social theory. And in Plato we found a view that was very organic. I mean, he offered a view of society that suggested that society is kind of a thing that should be examined in its own right. It has its own dynamic. It has its own needs, in a way. One minor theme in Plato, at least it seemed minor compared to some others, one minor theme in Plato is that the state, or society, isn't just some kind of tool or instrument that's designed for the good of the individuals. In a way, the individuals, like parts in a larger whole, should be evaluated in terms of what they contribute to the whole, to society. That's a question that, it sounds like, it could be that view of Plato's can be put in such a way as to make it sound remarkably intolerant of the importance of the individual, the desires of the individual. But if you think about your own consciousness of not even the political world, but just living in a society of other people, I think there's two sides to all of us. I think we're all of two minds on this issue at some level or another, no matter how individualistic we might sometimes claim that we are, or think that we are. I mean, it's not just that we're lying or fooling ourselves, but sometimes, we exaggerate the parts of us that are individualistic and neglect the fact that for almost every one of us, from time to time in our lives, if we feel like we're not making a contribution to something bigger than ourselves, we'll feel bad. And it might not be the society, but something outside of ourselves. If we're not doing something, then it'll be hard for us to make any kind of an estimate of our own worth that we'll rely on. I mean, we rely on kind of external measures to some large extent in deciding how worthy we are. And that's, I think, true of every person, no matter how individualistic they are in the main. And there's some sense in which we really need to have some kind of reflection from the outside world, from other people, to tell us what our value is. So this idea that the importance of an individual, at least to some extent, comes from contributions they make to a larger whole, that's not a completely alien idea, even to those of us who've grown up in a pretty individualistic society. And on the other hand, even those people who you might think of as completely organic in their thinking, all they care about is the contributions that individuals make to the whole, to the big society. That might seem very totalitarian, and of course that's part of the feature of totalitarianism, is that the state is the thing for which individuals must live their lives. Nonetheless, often the rationale for that, I mean, the argument that people might put forward for something like a totalitarianism is that that's what, in the long run, is best for individuals. So rightly or wrongly, I mean, people will argue that individuals can only be happy, can only be satisfied when they're making contributions to the larger whole, and that's the reason for it. So it's a kind of a two-edged sword. I mean, or a two-sided coin, however you want to put it. On the one hand, systems like Plato's emphasize the unity of the state organism and the importance of the whole, the importance of society as a whole, and the apparently less important role that individuals play as cogs in the big machine. Now, to be fair to Plato, he had a good theoretical reason for presenting things that way. His only reason for trotting out this whole theory of the states was supposedly because he wanted to figure out what justice was, and he claimed that, well, we'll be able to figure out justice in the state more easily than we'll be able to figure out justice in the individual, just because the state's so much bigger. And it's just be like, we can see it better. We can see what justice is in the state. Now, that's never struck me as a particularly plausible argument. Maybe I haven't really tried it on for size well enough. I don't know that stuff that's big is necessarily clearer than stuff that's small. But that's kind of the structure of Plato's argument. So the only reason for talking about the state as a whole, apparently, was for Plato that this would give us a clearer view of what abstract justice is. So maybe he had a theoretical excuse for doing that. Maybe he really didn't think of the state as such an important entity above and beyond the value and worth of individuals. But that's not the way the book is written. It really does look like he thinks that we should be trying to organize the state, the whole. That's the things that's important. And the questions of individual value, the things that are important to the individual, those are of lesser importance. It was just this, Plato, of course, had a meritocracy there. The state is to be organized and run by those people who know best how to do that stuff, people who've been trained all their lives at doing that stuff. We, as a society, should contrive to make sure that the people who take the positions of power in our society are going to be, the best at doing that job. Anything that Plato had his own little set of criteria that should be satisfied by anybody who's going to be a ruler, but you can perform the same thought experiment. You should figure out, if you want to be a Plato-type thinker, you figure out, all right, what is it that I think are really the key qualifications that someone who's going to be, take the office of President of the United States, for example, or people who are going to be in the positions of greatest power in society, what would the right qualifications be? And how can we see to it that we at least come close to ensuring that the people who take power actually get those qualifications? Now, your list of qualifications might be very different from Plato's. You might emphasize concern for individual well-being of the citizens more than Plato did. But it's the same ballgame. If you're in that ballpark, what you'll do, if you're a Platonist, if you're thinking like Plato, is you'll try to figure out, one, what are the qualifications that a really qualified ruler or leader should have, and two, how do we go about ensuring that the people who take those positions get those qualifications? The answer to neither question, according to Plato, is vote. I mean, for Plato, that's not going to get you the people who are the best qualified. And that's certainly not going to provide you with any assurances that the people who get into public office will have whatever qualifications you might like. It will ensure, Plato would have said, that the people who get into public office are most likely to have been skilled at persuasion, at persuading voters to vote for them. And that has nothing to do with qualities of rulers that at least Plato thinks most people would envision. So he was a thoroughgoing opponent to democracy, major thinker in the organic tradition of political philosophy, rather than the instrumentalist tradition. Those are the two that I distinguished earlier in the quarter. And he passed that mantle on to Aristotle, who still thought that the state was a device that was aimed at a good that transcended the individual well-being of the citizens. But he sort of made a step away from what I call the organic approach to the state toward the instrumental approach to the state, because he said that the state is a device that's aimed at promoting the greatest good. It's the kind of goods, if I read Aristotle correctly, the kind of goods he has in mind, the goods that just simply come from society and couldn't be originated by any individual. Things like culture, things like philosophy, things like science, things like art, things that no individual, all by himself or herself, could invent. And if you want to try and figure out the force of that, when he's saying that no individual could invent those things, I bet that folks that think like Aristotle in this regard would use language as a good example. I mean, you can't even picture somebody saying, boy, I'm tired of all this grunting around here, I'm going to invent language. I mean, that's just not something that an individual is in a position to do, logically speaking. Language has to evolve from those things like those grunts. It has to evolve in at least some small group of individuals, a group of people. No single person could invent it. And I think that the idea that there are some products of society that transcend the possibility that an individual could create them, things like culture, things like language, things like religion, or spiritual tradition, things like science, I think that's what's behind this notion that what the state is for is this transcendent stuff. There are the normal. You can easily imagine human-like animals or even human beings having all the normal physical needs. I mean, they're going to need food. They're going to need water. They're going to need some protection from the elements. They're going to need protection they need to protect themselves from predatory beasts. All of those things, you can imagine a single individual doing a pretty good job of gaining for himself, maybe doing a better job if he cooperates with other people. But this isn't yet what the state's for, according to Aristotle. It has an end, and the best way to understand anything, according to Aristotle, was in terms of what its purpose, what its function is. And the end of the state is for these transcendent goods, the things, the best goods of all, the highest goods, the things that characterize humanity. The human species, according to Aristotle, is different from every other animal species. He was prepared, he's a biologist, and even 2,500 years ago he would have described human beings as one of the animal species. But the thing about human beings is that they're the rational animal. It's reason that characterizes humanity. And so that's how we'll understand the highest goods of humanity in terms of this unique human feature. That's what the state's for, is to promote these rational virtues. So it has an end, it has a goal, it is an instrument. Nonetheless, the good that's being promoted transcends the interests of each individual. We are important. Again, this is much less clear in Aristotle than in Plato, but we are still important, at least when gauging our importance in terms of the state. We're important insofar as we can further this great end, further culture. Lots of institutions can be tolerated that we in the 20th century would find intolerable. Slavery, for example, is defended by Aristotle because as far as Aristotle could see, you really couldn't ever have real culture if everybody had to spend all their time making a living. You need to have a leisured class, an aristocracy. And to have an aristocracy, people who aren't spending all their time making a living, there has to be something that supports them. Somebody's got to be out there growing the crops and making the stuff. And that's the justification for slavery. From time to time, we don't justify slavery that way, but sometimes our utopian dreams imagine that sometime in the future, each human being will be able to fulfill his and her human potential, but this will be on the backs of machines. I mean, that's the way we now fantasize the future. Is that, someday machines will take care of all the drudgery, and human beings will be able to live this political life, this life of culture, where we all are fulfilling our human potential, which is very much like what Aristotle imagined the state was for. So while he was still an organic thinker insofar as he thought that the state, the importance of the state, transcended what it does for the individual, at least he emphasized that aspect. Nonetheless, he did see the state as an instrument for establishing those grand transcendent goals. Aristotle's criticism of Plato came in part because he thought that Plato emphasized the unity of the state too much. For Plato, it's this one, as a matter of fact, unity plays a strong role throughout Plato's philosophy as something that is somehow truer, more real than diversity, than multiplicity. The one is the real, and the more things get fragmented, the more there are many of them, then the less real they are, and I'm not going to try and get into that right now. But when applied to the state, Aristotle said, well, that goes awry. What Aristotle said about Plato was Plato's view of the state neglected the importance of diversity. The state is a coming together of lots of different people, lots of different talents, lots of different abilities. Diversity is what the state is all about. It's bringing all these folks together in a cooperative effort at producing this great transcendent end, culture, art, stuff like that. The realm of reason. And Aristotle quite literally said of Plato's view that the degree of unity that Plato emphasized would be the death of the state. Too much unity means that you no longer have this coming together of people for this grand transcendent purpose. He also thought that the whole idea that Plato had of this very special stratum of society, the guardians, who would provide the military protection and order, both internal and external order for the state, and the auxiliaries, the military folks, and then the guardians themselves who would provide the leadership. They would be the philosophers. The famous line from Plato is that we won't have a reasonable society until either the philosophers become kings or the kings become philosophers, meaning until people who have those positions of power really are wise and just, and they've been trained in these areas. Nonetheless, Aristotle's view of that whole picture was that it looked to him not like a society at all, but more like a kind of a garrison, where the guardians and the auxiliaries were an armed camp controlling the real society, which was the rest of the people. And that struck Aristotle as doomed to failure. Like Plato, Aristotle's proposal for society was for an aristocracy, a meritocracy. The good kind of aristocracy for Aristotle was the one where those few who were ruling, one or many, but those few who were ruling in the interests of all. And you'll remember that he, taxonomist that he was, he'd go out there and collect plants and stuff, try and categorize them, and he spent an awful lot of time and made great contributions toward taxonomy in biology. But in politics, he did the same thing. He collected all these constitutions to try and see what the different forms of government were that had been tried. He examined works like Plato's too, and works of some other theorists who discussed possible political systems that hadn't been tried yet. And he sort of categorized all these things and came to the conclusion that there were basically 3 true forms and 3 false forms, 3 deteriorated forms, 3 more or less perverted forms of government. The 3 good ones were, royalty, or monarchy if you like, aristocracy, and constitutional government. And the common feature, monarchy is the rule of one, aristocracy is the rule of a few, constitutional government was the rule of all, with the people, something kind of vaguely delineated. But what kept them all true forms was that in each case, the rulers, whoever they were always ruling in the interest of everybody. And in behalf of the transcendent goal that the state has, namely not just life, but the good life, the good human life. The deteriorated forms of government were, in the case of the government of one, tyranny; in the case of the government of 2, oligarchy; and in the case of the government of not 2, in the case of the government of a few, oligarchy; in the case of the government of the many, the deteriorated form is what you call democracy. In each of those cases, whoever got the power, whether it was one, a minority, or a majority, they ruled in behalf only of their own interests. So in the case of democracy, the way he understands that is when a majority gets power, and usually that would be the poor, since in his societies, like in probably almost all societies, if not all societies to this day, most of the people in any given society are relatively, anyway, poor. So for Aristotle, and for many of the Greeks, for Plato too, when they talked about democracy, they imagined the situation where the majority, the numeric majority, that is, the poor, get the power, and then they rule in behalf of themselves. So democracy almost inevitably would mean, for the Greeks, it would mean that the poor, at least at the limit, the poor would seize power, and then they would seize the riches of the wealthy, and they would redistribute the riches to themselves. And so that was the way he understood these alternatives. Aristotle liked the idea of constitutional government in practical terms, but preferred, if you could get it, either monarchy or aristocracy would be best. And in particular, if you found that there was one person in the society that had more virtue than anybody else, just plainly was sort of head and shoulders above everyone else in terms of virtue, you'd be crazy not to try to make that person king. Because that's what you're looking for, is virtue. Usually that doesn't happen, so then you would like to have the most virtuous people be in power. And virtue for Aristotle includes having a moderate degree of comfort, leisure, therefore wealth. I mean, it's not a virtuous life to be a mechanic. He infamously said, it's not a virtuous life to do what most of us have to do, namely work day in and day out. And the reason it's not virtuous is nothing that's blameworthy of people like that. It's that that's not as good a life as is possible. It would be better, a better human life, if you could spend more time, reflecting on how to improve society and reflecting on science, reflecting on art. And virtue for them are, those are standards of excellence. It's not standards of blameworthiness or praiseworthiness, exactly. Didn't go into that, I don't think, in detail here, but this way of using the term virtue means that you can use it to describe even inanimate objects, so that the virtue of a pen would be that it writes legibly. So pens can have virtues. And the virtue of human life would be anything that makes for a good human life, anything that would be better to have in the human life than not. So that's where leisure comes in. Now, that is pretty much the remote classics that we discussed, Plato and Aristotle. We tried to lay a foundation for subsequent discussions of these later thinkers in them. And what I'd like to do is to sort of suggest that there is kind of, while the questions remain philosophical, it's not just like, one person says, did to, did not, did to, did not. It's not just a back and forth like that, where people are constantly arguing and there's never any progress made. There's progress made, all right. I think that the discussions get somewhat more sophisticated. They pin down crucial details a bit. Now, I don't know whether this is going to go in one direction. I'm not sure whether there's not some details that are no longer the big objects of discussion. Maybe they'll come back, and they'll be the central focus of future political philosophy. But I tried to offer you an interpretation of at least these thinkers that suggests that there was a little bit of, there were things that got established in the course of time. And sometimes the movement is small, but there's movement there. Aristotle's move toward suggesting that the state should be understood as an instrument, while not yet leaving entirely the organic picture of the state as something whose value is in and of itself, and not just the value it contributes to individuals. That's a move that has kind of gotten picked up and has been then the theater of further dialogue. Hobbes, who wrote, of course, in a period of civil war, picked up the theme of the state as instrument. And given the particular concerns that Hobbes had, and that the people around him anyway in England in the 1600s had, the concerns they were worried about was, how do we stop this awful civil war? I mean, for Hobbes, you'll remember that in the absence of government, when government collapses, that's what you get, is you get civil war. Other words for that, it's a situation, it's the state of nature. It's a state of nature where there's really no control over the battles that people are going to have. Life is going to be solitary, poor, nasty, Brutus, and short. You need to stop the war. I mean, the goal is not where Aristotle's writing and saying that the goal of the state is for the promotion of the good life, not the rich life, not just in terms of cash, but the life of the arts, the life of science, the life of culture. Hobbes' sights are set a good deal lower. He thinks the purpose of the state is to establish at least a bare minimum of civility in which we can have industry, in which farming can go on, in which factories can be built, in which people can actually have projects that they have some hope that they can fulfill. In the absence of the state, all of this is up for grabs. The minute somebody tries to do something for themselves and their family, they've got to, in the absence of the state, if it weren't for the state, they'd have to worry that somebody else could come along and snatch it. And so nobody would bother with embarking on these projects. They wouldn't even try. So for Hobbes, that's what the state's for. Not the promotion of the grand life, but if there's going to be any grand life, then it's only through establishing a state that we have any chance at all of getting it, because without the state we can't even have a life, really. So that's why the state had such dire character with it. I mean, according to Hobbes, we would have reason, if we found ourselves in a state of nature, to agree with one another that anything is preferable. What we need is order. And it hardly matters what the details are. We need order. And we would find it reasonable to do whatever it takes to establish that order. So that's what we do when we make that original contract, we agree with one another, basically, to give whatever needs to be given to a single power who is then going to establish order over us. So what we've got to do, I mean, that all by itself establishes just how much we have to do. We have to figure out, you know, and each of us is watching each other with a suspicious eye, according to Hobbes. Each of us has to figure out, I'm going to watch to see how much that person gives up in the way of power. And I'm not giving up one bit more. I'll lay down my arms. I'll lay down my ability. I'll surrender my ability to defend myself too, but only if the other one does visibly. A contract, a paper contract, just a mere agreement, a promise is worthless unless it's backed up by force. And the only way to back it up by force is to build the enforcing power. That's the state. We recognize right up front that gives Leviathan, the state, whoever it is that we're turning power over, that gives that person, you know, license to do whatever that person pleases. But it's in that person's interest too to continue to keep us reasonably content. We can hope for that because that person will want us to continue to do productive things so that that person can tax us, so that that person gets luxuries and things that that person wants. We're giving somebody the option, in creating a monarch and creating a Leviathan, we're giving somebody the option to profit from all our labors because those are the only conditions in which we'll be able to profit ourselves. So that's the rationale for Hobbes. The state does have a purpose, it has an end, but it's not as grand a purpose as Aristotle had in mind. Locke can be understood in the same argument, the same discussion. His state of nature, of course, isn't nearly so brutal as the one that Hobbes envisions. You can think of Locke as saying, look, people can get along to some extent. It's not as bad as Hobbes thinks. It's not like everybody's going to be at everybody else's throat. There'll be some cooperation. Matter of fact, there'll be a lot of cooperation. I mean, people will see they will not only think up the rationale. They'll say, I think that we could cooperate and make great progress here and profit. People will experiment, and people will gain benefits from even large-scale cooperation. But for Hobbes, now that's all still in the state of nature. That's without forming a government, without having anything other than sort of evolving human cooperation on a kind of an ad hoc basis. People cooperate, they join in large-scale cooperative ventures as long as it seems profitable for them to do so. They drop out only when it seems profitable to do so. That's still all in the state of nature. And Locke imagines we can make great progress there, but we will be held back from making as good progress as we could because of certain inconveniences in the state of nature, where nobody really knows what the specific rules of interaction are. I mean, everybody's got their own appreciation, their own intuition about justice. And there's a lot of overlap. I mean, I think Locke would say, you know, you can go from culture to culture. You'll find there's a lot that's recognizable in another culture's system of justice. That's like you would find in the state of nature. I mean, different people would have different perceptions of the details, especially about what's just and what's not just in their own case. But there'd be lots of agreement about what's just and what's unjust. I mean, departing from Locke for a second and from this little scenario that I'm sort of this wrap up here. I mean, if you think about this, on the one hand, there's been a lot of emphasis in the 20th century, especially on how different cultures are, how there are different principles of right and wrong and different principles of justice. But that neglects a lot of commonality as well. And that neglects the fact that we can read the literatures of peoples that lived as long ago as you please. I mean, some of the literatures were written down. Sometimes we only have, you know, verbal reports of verbal reports of verbal reports. But you can go into almost every culture on the planet and listen to their stories, their sagas, their legends, and you can tell, even from this distance in time and space, you can tell who are the bad people and who are the good people. I mean, there's a lot of commonality there. There's a lot of common intuitions about what's just and what's unjust, what's unfair and what's fair. Sure, there's lots of disagreement in the detail. But there's also a lot of commonality, a lot of agreement. And I think that's what Locke would rely on. He'd say, you don't need to have a state, a particular society, a particular culture. The human condition just yields, once people have to live in it as individuals, in groups of people, the human condition yields all kinds of reasonably clear conclusions about what's just and what's unjust. If you don't write them down, however, if you don't really establish, all right, here are the clear-cut guidelines for our interaction, then that's when the differences are going to get you into trouble. And that's the problem with the state of nature. It's not that there isn't a common idea of justice and injustice. It's that it's not a very clear-cut idea. And that's what the state can bring with it. Number one, it brings with it a clear interpretation of what's right and what's wrong. Number two, it brings with it an institutional framework where you know who to take your claims to. There's courts, there's judges, there's a known and allegedly indifferent judge. At least the judge that you take your case to isn't one of the parties to the disagreement. In the state of nature, you got the people who are disagreeing are the only ones maybe who really care about the agreement, and there's nobody to turn to for adjudication. The state offers a remedy to that inconvenience as well. And finally, in the state of nature, enforcement is left to whoever can kind of muster sufficient backup. I mean, once a person has gotten into an argument with another person, they're both going to disagree about who was wrong and who was right. There's not going to be anybody to adjudicate it, but there's also not going to be any reliable, fair source of enforcement. It'll just be whoever has the most power. Now, that's not going to, it's not going to be too arbitrary. I mean, people take an interest in manifest injustices that they see. People will, in a community, even short of the state, people will get together to try to protect one another. And you'll protect people who are in your neighborhood, your group, your family, and there'll be all kinds of loyalties like that. But it's inconvenient if you can't have any kind of a reliable enforcement procedure. So it's not like there's a war of all against all, says Locke. He says, I go along with you, Hobbes, says Locke. And that's the theme as we move from each thinker to the other thinker. I hope you'll pick up on. It's not just all disagreement. They say, all right, I'll go along with this far, but here's now where I think you've gone wrong. So Locke says, I'll go along with you, Hobbes, that what we're faced with is, in trying to understand the justification for civil society, the justification for government, we're trying to remedy problems that would arise if we didn't have government. It's an instrument, just like Aristotle said. It's an instrument for resolving certain problems that human beings would have if they never got round to making governments. But the instrument doesn't have to be as severe as you make it out to be, Hobbes, because the condition, the natural condition, the state of nature, isn't as bad as you make it out to be. Instead, what we have is not a war of all against all, but just a kind of a relatively inconvenient, awkward situation when it comes to adjudicating principles of justice, which people can figure out themselves, even in the absence of government. Justice is there. The idea is there. It's not the state that makes justice, but we need the state to administer justice. So that's why we form a state. But that means that since the situation isn't so dire, I mean, if our state fails us, we don't fall back into hell. We don't fall back into a war of all against all. So we can risk a less powerful state. I mean, for Hobbes, boy, if the state screws up, we're all dead. For Hobbes, it's, well, no, if the state screws up, we'll have to try again. It won't be that bad. So you don't need such a terrifyingly awful Leviathan. All you need is an administrative machinery that will do the job, namely, relieve the inconveniences of the state of nature. And that also makes it possible, since you don't have to have such a powerful Leviathan, you're having something that Locke wants, that Locke wants to Locke wants to have as many checks and balances as possible here, so that one arm of government doesn't become more powerful than the other. I mean, Hobbes thought that was horrible. I mean, then we'll have war between the different arms of government if there isn't one that stands out as being the most powerful. Locke wanted there to be checks and balances just to make sure, if possible, or to make most likely. I mean, none of this. There's no guarantees that come with any of this stuff, of course. But Locke's idea is, well, that will make it most likely that we can control the government, make sure it does only those things that we had in mind. And for Locke, the things that it most plainly has in mind is protection of life, protection of human liberty, protection of property. Well, property, according to Locke, is something that's absolutely essential for human flourishing. Now, what that leads to in Locke is something that has since been called and we named the night watchman idea of the state. The basic role of the of the state is to provide sort of like watchman functions. It's not to increase the education or increase the well-being of people. The idea here is people are already involved in the project of bettering their lives, even in the state of nature. They're doing this individually. They're doing this cooperatively. We don't need the state to do that, but we need the state to sort of provide administrative guidelines within which human cooperation can go ahead and bloom and flourish. The night watchman state consists basically of police force, judicial force, prison force, or whatever else is in the enforcement end of it. But his argument for the night watchman state and for what we also call classical liberalism was based on the idea of natural rights. Now that distinguishes him from John Stuart Mill and the utilitarian tradition. Mill and the utilitarians didn't think that rights could ever form the basis of any kind of a moral or political philosophy. Rights would be shorthands at best for other considerations. Now, Jeremy Bentham, another utilitarian, said the whole talk of natural rights is nonsense on stilts. It's silly. It's stupid. There are no such things as natural rights. But there are reasonable considerations that you could look at that would lead you to conclude that society ought to foster life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So these rights aren't basic. They're not natural in any sense. They are instead the resultants of fairly sophisticated analyses of what, according to the utilitarians now, produces the greatest good for the greatest number. So what we should be doing is not trying to figure out what natural rights people have. We ought to try and figure out, still on the basis of facts about people, facts about society, facts about economics, say, facts about the availability of resources, we should figure out how we can promote the greatest good for the greatest number. And for John Stuart Mill, that was the reason for being in favor of a relatively minimal state in which free markets ruled for the most part. This is at least the early Mill. I think I mentioned to you that Mill came to be more convinced in his later life that there was a greater role for the central government to play. But earlier in his career, he seemed to be in favor of laissez-faire economics, like most of the other utilitarians. That put him in the same company with John Locke, but where they disagreed was about what's the basis for these conclusions. Now that argument between people who are consequentialists, who say that the way to figure out what institutions to have, the way to figure out even which things are right and which things are wrong, that all of that's based on consideration of the consequences. I mean, that whole tribe of people who say that's the way to figure out what's right and wrong, those people are called consequentialists, and the utilitarians like Bentham and Mill are in that camp. That argument between those folks and then the rights theorist, or even the natural rights theorist, continues to this day. I mean, one argument, I mean, it's easy to sort of find the consequentialist theory compelling, but one thing that makes people suspicious of it is this. I mean, let's say that it turned out that, quietly executing all the people over 6 feet tall would, for some reason or another, promote the greatest good for the greatest number. I mean, let's say you just figured that out. I mean, just for some reason, or maybe executing all the philosophers to keep it. Lots of people might agree that executing the philosophers would be, in the end, in the greatest interest of the greatest number. But whatever, you can see why that would be a little bit troubling. If it turned out that something like that was in the greatest interest of the greatest number, promoted the greatest good for the greatest number, then it seems like utilitarianism would sanction it. It would say, yeah, that's the right thing to do. It's not just that it's okay, that's the right thing to do. What you ought to do is whatever promotes the greatest good for the greatest number. And that's at least a little bit disturbing. Now, what utilitarians standardly say is, yeah, if it really did promote the greatest good for the greatest number to do something like that, then we sure would sanction it, but it couldn't. Well, why not? Well, because that would put everybody, just imagine it. That would put, one reason might be that would put everybody on notice that they might be offed if it just happened that their death was in the greatest good for the greatest number. That would be in nobody's interest. That would lead to a society that was very, very worried, very, very apprehensive, very anxious, very unhappy, not able to pursue, certainly not pursuing their own good in the best way. So what the utilitarians would respond is that this is a false hypothesis. It just can't happen. I mean, if people knew that that they were at risk of having harm come to them just on the basis of somebody's utilitarian calculations, that would be a horrible thing for society. That would be a very, very unpleasant society to live in. So that's why we actually have laws against those things. That's what justifies, even making individual rights sacrosanct. The Bill of Rights in our own Constitution says that individual rights, for example, to free speech, free assembly, to practice their own religion, that those rights will not be abridged even if the majority says so. That's basically what the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution says. It says, even if majorities want to take away somebody's freedom of speech, they can't. We're going to preserve them. Now, our Constitution is based on a natural rights view, like Locke's. But utilitarians are in a position to say such things are justified because in the end, they do promote the greatest good for the greatest number. To secure certain rights to people, that is justified because of this reasoning. And that's the way Mill and the utilitarians understood government, as being designed to promote utility, whatever it promote, to maximize all those things that are useful to people in their efforts to secure their own good. Okay. We also stressed that fact in Mill's argument for freedom of expression, which I think is one of the most glorious pieces of prose in all of political philosophy. The argument isn't that people have a natural right. The argument is that we need people to express views contrary to our own. It's not just that if we're going to expect other people to let us speak, that we have to let them speak too. It's not just that. As a matter of fact, that's not stressed at all in Mill's article. It may have been that he mentioned it, I can't even remember, but stress is placed on several arguments to the effect that we need others to express views contrary to our own, or else ours will lose life. We won't have any sense of their significance, their importance, what they mean, why we hold them. And we will hold them, Mill says, in the manner of a prejudice if we are not constantly in the presence of people vigorously promoting different beliefs. That's when we have something to bounce our own ideas off of. That's when we have some reason to think that our ideas might be right, is when we have to contrast them to other people's ideas that are different. I mean, that's when our ideas will be lively, they'll take on life, they'll have meaning, and it also will give us the opportunity to alter them, even renounce them if we come to the conclusion that the beliefs we have held really can't hold water in light of this new experience. And that's healthy. That's what beliefs are for. Beliefs are supposed to guide our behavior. If we're holding the wrong ones, then we're in trouble. I mean, our beliefs are our contact with the world and our contact with the future. And it's not good for us if we're not exercising them and exposing them to the possibility of improvement. That's anyway the structure of his argument. Now, those guys, Locke and Mill, were advocates of laissez-faire, advocates of a capitalist economy. We discussed the infamous Karl Marx, the famous and infamous Karl Marx and his views, his critiques of capital. And what I want to remind you of and stress once again is his critique was not the emotional one, not the ideological one that suggests that, well, capitalists are all greedy, capitalists are evil, capitalists ought to be kicked out because they're not sharing stuff equally. In fact, in the Communist Manifesto, written by Marx and Engels, again, a very important document that I urge you to read all the way through. If you didn't get a chance to do it before, do it. It's a very important document. But one of the things that's noticed too little in that document is that Marx spends quite a bit of time talking about the glories of capitalism, what capitalism has done, given its historical role. He doesn't think capitalism is blameworthy. As a matter of fact, if it weren't for capitalism, there'd be no chance for socialism. It's capitalism that's exposed what's possible. It's capitalism that's shown what labor can do, what people can do when they work on stuff. Capitalism has produced wonders that far surpass the combined product of all previous human generations. Now that's strong stuff. And I think it should be clear to you that he's not saying that there's something that is forever and always wrong about capitalism. In fact, if you dig deeper into Marx, you'll see that his real view is that capitalism was revolutionary and the right thing for a particular period of time. But in the end, over time, once capitalism has played its role in the historical theater, in the human scene, it's going to have to pass. It has brought us up to the point where the seeds of its own destruction have been sown. It's the one that produced the seeds of its own destruction. And it will be succeeded by the next and final stage of what Marx called the humanity's prehistory, namely the socialist stage. The idea was that capital has produced the proletariat, the working class. There was no working class as such. There were peasants, of course. There were poor people, but there was no working class. There was no factory workers because there were no factories. No industrial laborers. This category of persons has been created by capitalism, a category of persons who have to be paid less than what they really are, what they really deserve by the product of their labor, or else there wouldn't be any profits on Marx's theory. Profit is just the margin between what the products really are worth and what labor costs. If labor got the whole worth of the product that they make, there would be no profits. Capitalists would have no motivation. So profits are something that are laid down on top of the value of the product. The whole value of the product, according to Marx, just as it was according to his predecessors among the laissez-faire capitalists, just as it was for Locke, the whole value of any product is put into it by labor, or virtually the whole value. So if somehow capitalists are getting profits out of it, that means that there's something going on that is now in need of correction. And once, it's not because of ideology again that the socialist revolution is going to come, once workers realize the power that they have, that they produce everything, that they are not only the producers of all value. I mean, they're the ones they produce the fur coats, the limousines, they dig the swimming pools, they build it. No capitalist does any of that stuff. They do every bit of the work. Everything is done by workers. They are even the policemen. They are even the army. They are everybody. No capitalist is toting a gun to protect capital against the worker. It's workers doing that. And once workers realize this, that's when capitalism will fall. Those are the seeds of the destruction of capitalism. It's the proletarian class. And capitalism has even set things up, according to Marx. So it's bound to occur. They're bringing all these workers into the same place, the factory, where they can talk. And then when they lay huge numbers of them off, they all go to the same places to look for other jobs. They have time to talk when they're not working. They have time to talk when they're working. So they're bringing them all together. So the consciousness, the self-consciousness, is now almost inevitable. If they were separated, as peasants often were, if they were separated and didn't get to talk, then this consciousness might not ever be raised, but it's going to be raised now. And you can see them talking. That's Marx back in the middle of the 19th century. Revolution's in the air. Yes, sir?
That's why they have cubicles now.
Cubicles, right. And by the way, that's an interesting point, too. In the Communist Manifesto, and this isn't something that we emphasized before, it's not just the factory workers that capitalism's created. Capitalism has taken every profession and made workers out of it. It used to be, the doctors and other professionals, lawyers, could be thought of as non-workers. They had a kind of a mystique. But what capitalism has done is to commodify everything. Everybody's an employee. I mean, he said this. This is a very interesting work. I mean, you could read Dilbert, through the eyes of Karl Marx. But it's true. The people who work in the cubicles, maybe they're separated away so they get the work done. But there's the coffee machine and the water cooler. They're gathered over there and they'll talk about their plight. And so, but he's thinking that everybody is. I mean, capitalism is making workers out of everybody. Everybody. I mean. Doctors are no longer independent. Lawyers are no longer independent. They work for HMOs. They work for whatever. I mean, they've got their organizations they work for firms. They're hired. They get wages. Now, some of this you might think of as exaggeration, but there's lots of folks who continue to be sort of surprised that Marx could have written all this stuff in 1860, because it really looks like it bears a strong resemblance to the current situation. And interestingly enough, another thing we didn't emphasize, I don't think, when we talked about Marx, is he thought that the revolution might be peaceful, slow. It might be an evolution in some places. And in particular, he named America and Holland as places where, this revolution might be an evolution in those places. And I've often wondered what Marx would say about the intervening history of the United States from the days of what were called the robber barons to the present day, when we don't have robber barons anymore. We have corporations who are regulated. We have labor movements that from time to time have some sort of power. Labor up until the 20s or so was whenever there was a strike, the position of government was to be on the side of the boss. And cops would be sent out to break up the strike. But the way things have evolved is that's certainly no longer the case. And I wonder how Marx would describe the intervening years. Since Marx wasn't very clear on what he thought socialism would look like, I wonder which he would think is more socialist, the United States or the recent Soviet Union. I mean, I just don't know. I mean, one thinks that he must have envisioned something like the Soviet Union. But no, he didn't. Now this we did mention, I think. This was to be the only place where a socialist revolution could occur, according to Marx, would be in highly evolved industrial economies. I mean, it would have to be someplace in the industrialized part of Western Europe. It'd have to be in Germany, in France, in England, and maybe Holland, maybe the United States, or maybe there some places they'd have peaceful evolutions rather than revolutions. But it can only happen where there's a proletarian class and where capitalism has evolved to the point where it's ready to go belly up. But that's not where the communist revolutions of the 20th century occurred. The first big one, the most important one, was in Russia, a peasant society, not a developed society, not industrialized. And Lenin had to almost turn Marx upside down to make that revolution, to make sense of that revolution as a Marxian revolution. He had to renounce the whole idea of revolutions happening only when they are economically ready to happen. He had to advance instead the very opposite idea, that no, we need a small revolutionary cadre who will lead people into a revolution long before they would otherwise be conscious of it. Where was the other big communist revolution? Well, 1948 in China. Again, not one of the major industrialized countries. So these are not the places where Marx imagined that his revolution would occur. And his revolutions were to happen not because some ideology said that they should. They were supposed to happen as an automatic consequence of the evolving material conditions of production. So it's interesting to contemplate what Marx would say about the intervening events after his death. Marx definitely favored that the means of production should be centrally controlled. I mean, this stuff is explicitly in the Communist Manifesto and discussed also elsewhere in Marx's works. He explicitly believed that the problems of capitalism, I mean, the solutions, I mean, he didn't, as again, he wasn't too specific, but the solutions would come from taking the property rights and the means of production and placing them in the hands of the people, in the hands of the proletariat, the hands of, in short, the government, because he imagined that the government was going to be a dictatorship of the proletariat. So we're going to seize the factories, seize the banks, seize all the capital resources, and make them publicly owned, and that means centrally controlled. It also means that we're no longer going to be running on a profit incentive, or at least we're going to phase out the profit incentive. Some places he mentions that, well, this is going to have to be gradual. And while not specific about what that meant, there might be some use of profits as a mechanism for a while, but the objective was to do away with profiteering and do away with this margin that was, really owed to the laborers, to do away with that whole idea of profit, and to make prices, to socially control prices, so that, for example, one imagines that prices of things that are really needs, like food, would be held within people's means, that we wouldn't let the economy go running off producing, frivolities when necessities were running short, that all this would be centrally controlled. And so there's at least that you could say is common ground between Karl Marx and the genuine theories that he held, and some of the communist states that followed. They all agreed with that. And it's that particular issue that Friedrich Hayek addressed. Hayek contended that this whole idea of central control is going to be impossible to maintain. And we've done Hayek quite recently, and Rawls too, so I'm not going to try and address them in quite as great detail as I wanted to talk about some of the earlier folks, just because I wanted to bring them back a little bit more vividly to your memory. But you'll remember from a couple of weeks ago that Hayek's main complaint was that Marx completely misunderstood the nature of the values of things, completely misunderstood the vital function played by price mechanisms, completely misunderstood the vital role played by profit motive, and that the whole thought that something as complicated as a national economy could be run by some central office, some central bureau, that whole idea made no sense at all. That the information passed for a variety of reasons. Information passed within the economy would not pass quickly enough to be effective. That even if you had the most amazing mechanisms for bringing information up to the central controllers, and processing it, you still couldn't, even with the best of, this is well before contemporary computers, but the argument could still be made that even with the best, the fastest, the biggest computers that we even are planning, they'd never be able to assimilate, process, and do the kinds of calculations that would need to be calculated. Because prices represent too many things. They represent desires, plans, availabilities, all kinds of things that's very difficult to even know about because they're changing constantly. They're different from place to place and from time to time. All of this is calculated in prices on a market. And so the basic Hayekian complaint was that whether socialist goals are good things or not, that's not the point. Socialist means can't work. That shelves will be stocked with the wrong things, and you'll never be you won't know why. You won't have any clear-cut answers to questions. Well, how come last time when we produced this much bread, it was all wrapped up the shelves, and how come this time it's not? Part of the reason is because people change their desires and needs. People find substitutes. People do all kinds of other things that you can't control, even in the most rigidly controlled society. So you'd have surpluses of one thing that you don't need surpluses of, and you have tremendous shortages of another thing that you desperately need. The market can take care of this because it is a big computer. It is an amazingly quick computer that passes that information virtually immediately wherever it's needed. So he said, whatever the social goal might be, what you need is markets to process the information quickly and efficiently. That's the only way you'll be able to, unless you have markets, that's the only reason you'll be able to achieve any social goals. Now, there were other things that contributed to my calling Hayek a conservative, but that's the basic contention that I wanted to leave you with as far as Hayek's concerned. And Rawls finally set up a methodological framework that led him to the conclusion that reason, as manifested by the deliberations of the parties to the original position behind their veil of ignorance, reason would lead people to say that we will not allow in our society any inequalities unless they are to the advantage of the least well off. And what that would mean in connection with Hayek's argument is that if Hayek is correct that free markets are indeed in the best interest of, among other alternative institutional setups that you might have, that among all the different institutional setups, if free markets really are what's in the greatest interest of the least well off in society, then they could be allowed even on a liberal reading. Then that would be the argument that you'd need to make for free markets. But if not, and there might be many other institutional arrangements, I think, and I'm pretty sure Rawls suspects that there are, at least in a society like our own, there are many other institutional arrangements short of completely free markets that might be better for those who are least well off in society. And the reason why we would prefer that, why reason dictates that, is because when you neglect things that are irrelevant from the point of view of justice, when you focus only on those things that are really relevant, according to Rawls, well, then you come to the conclusion that each of us, there but for the grace of God go I, each of us might have wound up in the position of the least well off in society. And considering that, each of us has good reason to say, okay, that's what social cooperation ought to help. That's the main benefit of social cooperation, is making sure that everybody is as good off as they could possibly be. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody's equal, but we're going to try and bring the least well off up as much as we possibly can. That's the whole course. It was supposed to tweak your interest in political and social theory. My own view, which I've stated elsewhere, is that I don't know that the classroom is the best place for doing philosophy. I think, over drinks or coffee or, just hanging around with friends, that's the best place to do philosophy. But this may have served as some way of preparing the ground for conversations of that kind that you'll have with others. And I hope you've had some fun in the notes conference and some fun in the course itself. For now, that's it, and I hope you all have wonderful lives from left to right. Perhaps I'll see you again in some other course, or in the halls, or down at the bar, or something like that.